Wait, Arjun! Look at me! Look at my hands, they are empty. Wait for me to stand. Wait for my wheel to rise. Let us fight as men. Arjun, follow your Dharma! Strike, Arjun! This is not a duel. This is the removal of an obstacle to a new world.
For the next 15 minutes, forget the temple songs. We are going to open the dark files of Mahabharata. 10 specific moments where Krishna didn't just break the rules, he shattered them. We'll look at the instances where he chose path of shadows over the path of light, where he orchestrated outcomes that felt profoundly unfair. We've been told the story of a great war fought for righteousness, led by a figure of a divine grace. But if we pull back these curtains of incenses and prayers, you will find something far more disturbing. You find a character who didn't just understand the games, he rigged it. Today we are not talking about God, we are talking about the Deceiver. I want you to look at the evidence. I want you to sit with the discomfort, because by the end of this video you'll have to decide for yourself. If Krishna truly broke the rules of Dharma, why do these very scriptures still call him a divine figure? We begin at the very bedrock of honor, Bhishma. Bhishma was the only thing standing between the Pandavas and total annihilation. He was so powerful that he could have ended the whole war by himself on the very first day, wiping out all 5 brothers before the sun could even set. But he spared them day after day, because he was the Pitamaha, the grandfather who had once carried these boys on his shoulders. Krishna saw the hesitation and knew that as long as Bhishma stood, the war was already lost. So, he reached into the past and pulled out a secret, Shikhandi. Bhishma had taken a vow never to strike a woman or anyone who had been one. Shikhandi, born with a complex gender identity, was the perfect loophole. Krishna forced Arjun to hide behind a human shield and strike the very man who had raised him, taught him to walk, and loved him more than life itself. Shoot, Arjun, Krishna urged, showing no mercy for the bond they shared. As the arrows tore through Bhishma's chest, the old man didn't look at his grandson with anger. He looked at Krishna with a knowing, tragic silence. Was this the brilliant move of a savior? Or was it this exact moment that the chivalry was extinguished in the battlefield of Kurukshetra? Then we move from the grandfather to the teacher, Dronacharya. Drona was the master, the very person who had taught both sides the secret of the bow. On the battlefield, he was a whirlwind of divine weapons. As long as he held the sword, the Pandavas were fighting a ghost. Physical defeat was impossible. So Krishna targeted Drona's only weakness, his son Ashwatthama. Under Krishna's direction, a rumor was weaponized. An elephant named Ashwatthama was killed, and the cry went out, "Ashwatthama is dead," but the cruelty was in the acoustics. Drona turned to Yudhishthira, the man who could not lie. And Krishna, standing right there, signaled for the deception to be completed. Krishna orchestrated the roar of war trumpets to drown out the final saving word, the elephant. In that moment, Drona didn't lose a battle. he lost the will to exist. He dropped his weapons and sat in meditation, waiting for the blade to find his neck. He fell because the god that he had respected so much had taken a father's purest love and turned it into a lethal trap. How do we justify a win if the price was the integrity of a god and the heart of a father? As the sun began to dip on the 14th day, the stakes shifted from victory to survival. Arjun had taken a vow: he would kill Jayadratha before sunset, or he would cast himself into the sacrificial fire. They hid Jayadratha behind a wall of steel, simply waiting for the clock to run out. And then it happened. The darkness fell. The sun had gone down. The Kauravas cheered. Jayadratha, thinking himself safe, stepped out from the shadows. But the darkness wasn't night. It was a shroud. Krishna had used his Sudarshana chakra to mask the sun, creating a false dusk to lure a man out of hiding. It was a psychological ambush. As Jayadratha looked up in triumph, Krishna withdrew the shadow, revealing that the day was not yet done. Before the scream could leave Jayadratha's throat, his fate was sealed. Krishna didn't just win a fight. He had tricked the whole universe. He forced an outcome by making the whole world believe a lie. Was this a miracle of protection, or was it a cold-blooded execution disguised as destiny? If there was ever a man who had lived in the shadows of unfairness, it was Karna. Abandoned at birth and mocked as a charioteer's son, his entire life was a desperate hunt for the dignity that the whole world had refused him. On the 17th day, that world finally closed in. His chariot wheel sank into the bloody mud of Kurukshetra. In a moment of pure desperation, Karna appealed to the one thing he was always denied: Dharma. He asked for mercy, reminding Arjun that the laws of war forbid striking an unarmed man. But Krishna didn't offer mercy. He offered a cold list of grievances. He stood on the chariot and recited every mistake Karna had ever made, every insult he had ever thrown. Most tragically, Krishna was the only one on that field who knew the truth, that Karna was Arjun's own elder brother. Yet, he didn't call for a hug or a ceasefire, he called for blood. While Karna's hands were in the dirt, trying to lift his destiny out of the earth, Krishna commanded the strike. He didn't allow Karna the honorable death of a hero. He ensured the great warrior fell not in a blaze of glory, but struggling and helpless in the mud. Was this justice? Or was this the final calculated betrayal of a man whose only crime was trying to stand in a world where Krishna had already decided that he had to stay in the dirt? The war was over, yet it all came down to this: 2 men, 2 maces, and a circle of dust. Duryodhana stood alone, the last of his bloodline. He had watched 99 brothers fall, one by one, and now he was fighting with the desperate disciplined mastery of a king who had nothing left but his honor. As the hours bled away, it became clear: Bhima was failing. According to the sacred laws of the duel, you strike the chest or the head, but never, ever below the navel. To do so is to forfeit your humanity. Krishna stood on the sidelines, watching the momentum shift. He saw a future where the right side lost because they followed the right rules. With a cold, calculated look, he caught Bhima's eye and simply tapped his own thigh. A signal. A moment later, the crack of Duryodhana's breaking femurs echoed across the field. The man who survived the loss of 99 brothers fell to the ground. Not because he was outnumbered, but because he was outmaneuvered by a god who had decided that rules were just an obstacle to a result. If victory is won by a fall, is it still a victory? Or is it just a successful crime? If the battlefield was where the rules were broken, the palace was where it was rewritten. We've seen Krishna the Shire-deer, the man who guided the arrows. But to truly understand him, we have to look at Krishna the architect. The Kurukshetra war wasn't actually won in 18 days. It was won over 18 years of whispers, secret pacts, and invisible strings. While the warriors were polishing their armors, Krishna was playing a human chess. He was looking decades into the future, moving humans like pawns to ensure that when the first sword was finally drawn, the outcome was already inevitable. He didn't just win a war, he made it impossible to lose. We start with a decision that felt like a betrayal of trust. Subhadra was Krishna's own sister. Arjun was his best friend. To the rest of the world, their marriage should have been a grand diplomatic affair. Instead, Krishna whispered a suggestion in Arjun's ear: abduct her. Why? Because a traditional wedding would have required the consent of the family, including Balarama, who favored the Kauravas. By orchestrating a bold escape, Krishna bypassed the democratic process of his own kingdom. He bound his sister into a life of war and secured a bloodline that would eventually inherit the throne. Was this a brother looking out for his sister's heart? Or a politician securing his most important alliances by any means necessary? Then there is the matter of Jarasandha. He was a tyrant, yes. He had imprisoned hundreds of kings to sacrifice them to his own ambitions. But Jarasandha was also a king of Magadha, a man entitled by every law of time to a formal declaration of war. He deserved the chance to lead his armies and meet his fate on an open battlefield. But Krishna didn't want a war. At least, not yet, because Krishna knew that if the Kurukshetra war began with Jarasandha still on his throne, the Pandavas would be trapped. They would be fighting the Kauravas in the north and a vengeful Jarasandha in the east. To Krishna, Jarasandha wasn't just a villain, he was a third party that made the math of victory impossible. So, he chose a strategic removal over a fair fight. Under the cover of night, disguised as humble monks, Krishna led Bhima and Arjun into the heart of Jarasandha's palace. He used the king's own sense of religious duty to trap him into a duel he couldn't refuse. For 27 days, they watched a man fight for his life in his own home. And when Jarasandha was finally tired, Krishna gave the signal to end him. There were no heralds, no witnesses, no honor. He eliminated the wild card to ensure that his players had a clear way to the throne. It was a cold, calculated move that proved only one thing. In Krishna's world, the end always justifies the means. If Jarasandha was a strategic removal, then the death of Ghatotkacha was something far more intimate. Ghatotkacha was the son of Bhima. He was family. He was the powerhouse of the Pandava army, a giant who was single-handedly tearing through the Kauravs' ranks at night. But as he fought, Krishna wasn't cheering for his success. He was waiting for his fall. He knew Karna possessed the Vasavi Shakti, a one-time used divine spear that could kill anyone, including Arjun. As long as Karna held that spear, Arjun was a dead man walking. So, Krishna unleashed Ghatotkacha. He sent his own nephew into the center of the fire, knowing that the Kauravas would eventually panic and force Karna to use his ultimate weapon. When the spear finally pierced Ghatotkacha's heart and the giant fell, the Pandavas wept. But Krishna smiled. Not out of cruelty, but because he had traded a nephew to save a friend. He had used a family member as a resource to drain his enemy's power. In that smile, we see the most unsettling side of the Deceiver. A man who can look at the remains of his own kin and see nothing but a successful transaction. Before the first arrow was notched, the war was won in a quiet room through a piece of psychological theater. Both Arjun and Duryodhana arrived at Krishna's bedside to ask for his alliance. Krishna, playing the role of the neutral party, offered a choice that appeared fair on the surface. On one side, the Narayani Senna, millions of battle-hardened soldiers. On the other, himself unarmed and under a vow not to strike a single blow. Look at how the choice was staged. Krishna ensured that Duryodhana was the one to choose first. He knew Duryodhana's mind better than Duryodhana himself. He knew that a man blinded by his own greed and material power would always choose quantity over quality. By letting him win the army, Krishna made him feel like he had outsmarted a god. It was a brilliant bit of misdirection. By giving the Kauravas his soldiers, he effectively hollowed out their strategy. He gave them the muscle, but he kept the nervous system. He knew that 10,000 swords are useless if the hand that guides them is being outplayed by the person who trained them. He didn't just give away the army. He burdened his enemy with a massive, leaderless force that he knew how to dismantle from the inside. He allowed Duryodhana to walk away with the pride of a winner, while he stayed behind with the certainty of a victor. It wasn't a gift, it was a Trojan horse of a mind. The final piece of the puzzle isn't a battlefield deception, it's a diplomatic one. After years of planning, after the strategic eliminations and the psychological games, Krishna did something that seemed to contradict everything he had done before. He walked into the lion's den of the Kaurava court unarmed and alone. He didn't demand the throne. He didn't even demand half the kingdom. He asked for 5 villages. Just 5. On the surface, it looked like a plea for peace, a desperate one. But for our strategist, this is where the water gets murky. Was this a genuine attempt to save millions of lives, or was it the final check in the game of a moral chess? Perhaps by making an offer so small, so humble, that it was almost impossible to refuse, Krishna was performing a moral audit of the enemy. If the Kauravas said no to 5 villages, they weren't just greedy, they were proving to the world that they were a force that couldn't be reasoned with. When Duryodhana famously replied that he wouldn't give enough land to pin a needle, he may have unwittingly handed Krishna the very thing he needed, a moral license. From that moment on, any rules that Krishna broke, or any kind of cheat he orchestrated, it could be framed as a necessity. The peace mission might not have been an attempt to stop the war at all. It might have been the moment where Krishna got the permission from the history and from himself to win it by any means necessary. But was he seeking peace? Or was he just seeking an excuse? I know what you're thinking. For the last 15 minutes, I've painted a picture of a god who is cold, manipulative, and willing to sacrifice his own integrity for a win. If this were any other person in history, we'd have condemned him by now. We'd have labeled him as the villain and just closed the book. And honestly, if you look at these 10 events in a vacuum, it's really hard to see him as anything else. I've purposely shown you the shadow of Krishna because for too long we've looked at this light without acknowledging the cost of fire. But here's the thing. I don't think that he's a bad guy. I've spent months looking into this text and the more I saw this cheating, the more I started to see something else. Something much more tragic, something that most of us wouldn't be able to carry. To understand why I believe that the Deceiver might have been the greatest hero of all time, we have to stop looking at the rules and start looking at the stakes instead. Stick with me for a few more minutes because we are about to look into the surgeon's philosophy and the heavy, heartbreaking price that Krishna paid for every rule he ever broke. Let's look at the world Krishna was born into. It wasn't a world of clear-cut good versus evil. It was a world where the good guys, the elders, the teachers, the kings, were using their honor to protect a system that allowed a queen to be humiliated in public. Krishna realized something terrifying. If you play a fair game against a corrupted system, then the system wins every time. Perhaps he didn't break the rules because he didn't respect them. Perhaps he broke them because he was the only one who loved the world enough to sacrifice his own reputation to save it. Now, to understand Deceiver, we have to look at the alternative. We have to ask the question, what if Krishna had played by the rules? What if he had stayed pure and let the Kauravas win? Imagine a world ruled by Duryodhana's ego and Shakuni's malice. The public humiliation of a queen would have become a standard of power, not a crime. The warrior's code, the very one Bhishma and Drona died for, would have been used as a weapon to protect tyrants, while the common man suffered in silence. The Kauravas didn't just want a kingdom, they wanted a world where their whims were the law. If Krishna hadn't bent the rules, he wouldn't have been a good god. He would have been an accomplice to the end of civilization. He saw a future of darkness so thick that no amount of fair play could pierce it. He did not choose to be a liar. He chose to be the man that burned the old dying forest so that a new one could grow. He realized that sometimes you have to break the law of the land to save the law of humanity. Think about a surgeon. When a surgeon picks up a scalpel and cuts into the human body, is that an act of violence? If you saw it in a vacuum without context, you'd see knife, blood, and a person being harmed. Some might even call it a crime, but we don't. We call it healing. This is the lens through which I have viewed Krishna. By the time the armies gathered at Kurukshetra, the body of society was riddled with a deep-rooted decay. The honor of Bhishma was protecting a predator. The silence of the elders was empowering a tyrant. The rules weren't saving the world anymore. They were the very thing killing it. We have weighted the evidence. We have seen the blood on the sand, the lies in the dark, and the calculated deaths of family and friends. And throughout this entire investigations, you may have doubted his methods. You may have felt that a god should be above the mud of this world. But there was one person in Mahabharata who didn't just doubt him. She was certain of his guilt. Gandhari. The queen mother who had lost 100 sons to Krishna's grand design. As she stood among the ruins of her dynasty, she didn't see a savior. She saw a cold-blooded architect of misery. She looked at the god standing before her and she did the unthinkable. She cursed him. She demanded that just as her family had perished through his deceptions, his own bloodline, the Yadavas, would turn upon one another in a mindless frenzy. And this is the moment that defines Krishna. He didn't argue. He didn't explain the surgeon's philosophy. He didn't use his divine power to shield himself from a grieving mother's pain. He simply bowed his head and said, "So be it." He accepted the dissolution of everything he had ever loved as a fee for the war that he had won. He was willing to let his own name be tarnished for eternity, and his own children to be lost, just to ensure that the cycle of tyranny was broken for the rest of us. He didn't just bypass the rules of the war, he paid for those with his very own soul. History remembers the victors, but Dharma remembers the sacrifices. Krishna didn't win the war by being perfect. He won the war by being willing to be misunderstood for eternity. I'm Janvi Gauchan, and I leave you with this. If saving the world meant you had to be a villain in someone else's story, would you do it?